Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're continuing our series on villains by talking about Doctor Doom. We're looking at the question of, where is the line between a villain or an anti-hero? How much do the motivations of a villain matter, and how does that change the way we see him? And how is it that Doctor Doom, the character who's appeared in more Marvel comics than any other character, has been portrayed from so many different moral standpoints? I'm joined by special guest and frequent Panda contributor, Scotty St. Clair. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host. Quick note, I'm continuing to have microphone problems on this end. We've moved my computer around, and unfortunately my good microphone is not working. I'm hoping I can get it back up going. Unfortunately, I'm recording 3 podcasts tonight, so it might be a bit of a struggle, but we'll do our best to get this sound up to good quality. I think, dealing with a little bit of a cold. It's not COVID, I promise. But so my voice is not the best tonight. My microphone's not the best tonight. And that'll probably be true of a couple Star Wars episodes coming soon as well. But we are going to get that taken care of. And by the next superhero ethics episode, I will either have a new mic or have gotten this one working again. So apologies for all that. But thank you so much for being here. And I'm so excited for this conversation. And so, Scotty, why don't you start by introducing yourselves?
Well, thank you. Yeah. As you mentioned, my name is Scotty St. Clair. In terms of my involvement with the Stranded Panda Network, as I imagine with most fans, I kind of came on board with the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast back in 2016. And, I was kind of a quiet listener, didn't submit too much feedback, just kind of did my thing. But as the network kind of grew and folks like you and Ashley became more frequent contributors, and, of course, the launch of the Twitch channel and trivia and whatnot, it's just been really awesome to become more actively involved and actually have the opportunity to pop up on shows like this with great folks like yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed getting to know you first through our trivia nights and then through some of the special events I've done, and then hearing you on other podcasts. And so when you talked to me about this idea you had for focusing on Doctor Doom especially as another way to look at this question of villainy and anti-heroes and sort of where we draw the lines, I was really into it. So let me actually start with there. If you want to kind of give a quick summary of what was it that made this particular topic and this character and this take on villainhood, or on villainy, something you wanted to explore?
Yeah, of course. So as you mentioned, you put the call out there asking for topics. And when I think superhero and ethics, my mind immediately kind of tends to go towards the villains. I think,
me too.
Yeah, from a moral standpoint, they're a little more interesting to explore. And I kind of came up with the idea just off the top of my head. I thought, really, what does separate a hero from an anti-hero from a villain? And are there any characters that applies to all three? And the first one to come to mind was Doctor Doom. He's got a very rich history as the nemesis of the Fantastic Four. And, they're kind of the first family for Marvel. So they've been around since the 60s. And Doom, in terms of the comics, they've kind of had a storied history with the movies. Sometimes the movies haven't always prioritized the Fantastic Four in terms of the comics. But even with that said, Doom has always been a main focal point for the Marvel Universe as one of the standout villains. And he's not always just a villain. There are a lot of times that I think he could be described as more of an anti-hero and in some cases a hero. So I think he's perfect for this discussion.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to it because, as I've said before, I'm a dirty casual. I have been learning about the comics and I've read some, but most of my knowledge comes from TV and movies. And so I don't know much about Doctor Doom, I have to be honest. I've been hearing so much about him. I know that in 2 different movie franchises now, people have been very unhappy with how he appeared. I mean, they were unhappy with everything about both those Fantastic Four movie iterations.
Sure.
But let's just start here, and without going into too much detail, but kind of giving an overview, both for myself and for those who are listening who are maybe, like me, more just movies, TV show fans.
Yeah.
Tell us about Doctor Doom. Who is this character, and why is it that he's one who can have such kind of a wide moral range, depending on his appearance?
Yeah, of course. And for those more casual fans out there, if you are interested in getting to the comics, one of the runs that I would recommend that does a really good job of encapsulating Doom's origins for a more modern era is Ed Brubaker's run from the early 2000s. It's called The Book of Dooms, and it's basically, they do kind of a documentary kind of style approach to it. But getting into the actual character, he is Victor Von Doom. He is the nemesis of the Fantastic Four, and more chiefly, the leader of the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards. They have a long-standing rivalry. They attended school together. In the comics, it's just State University, which is a stand-in for New York State University. They were both top of their class. If one wasn't the one correcting the professor, it was the other one. They had a begrudging respect for each other. But ultimately, it was Victor's pride and his hubris that was his undoing, which caused him to become the villain that he is. His experiments were always considered unorthodox and morally ambiguous, and that kind of created the friction with him and Reed. And as the Fantastic Four developed their powers and became more and more popular, he was frequently a thorn in their side. And other things to bring up in terms of his character, he is a monarch. That's kind of an interesting aspect to his character. He is the leader of a country, Latveria, which is set in Europe, probably not too far from Sokovia. People that are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast are familiar with that one. But yeah, I think in terms of who he is as a character, the fact that he is a monarch and he protects these people, that is kind of what alludes to this position that he's put into, where he's not always this mustache twirling, cackling villain. He actually has some more altruistic motivations in terms of defending his nation and his people.
In reading about the character, that's one of the things I was most fascinated by. There's one article that I read that talked about how he started as kind of your general stand-in for the mad scientist trope. Like you said, the unorthodox experiments and the rival with Reed, and that sometimes it was about ego or about the fact that they were both competing romantically for Sue Storm or however that was. But that over time, he became this much more complex and nuanced characters, and that especially had to do with his motivations. And I think that's, like you, I love villain characters, and one of the things that I'm often most interested in is their motivations. And, are they just the mustache twirler who wants ultimate power or lots of money or control, or do they have things that are driving them? And so talk a bit about that. What is it you think that drives Doom? And what are his main... I mean, obviously, he's been a character over thousands of comic books. Just reading about him, reading his Wikipedia page, there's just page after page of all the different ways he's appeared in different alternate universes and things like that. So, take that 50, 60-year history of a character, and if you wouldn't mind, just summarize it in a couple sentences of what does he want?
What does he want? He's a very ego-driven character initially. So it is very much that to be the alpha, to have absolute power is his goal. And in the early comic book roles, it's pretty much surface. That is what it is. He's after ultimate power. But as we transition into the modern era, his motivations do become a little more nuanced. I referred to the fact that he's defending his nation in Latveria. But he's also got, we find out as we learn more about his backstory, part of his motivation to gain this ultimate power is because he's actually trying to save his mother. His mother actually sold her soul to some demon characters, Mephisto chiefly here. And that was an attempt to actually free the people of Latveria, which in turn kind of put him in the position to become the ruler. But from a surface standpoint, if you want to kind of boil it down to what his motivations are, he's very prideful, very ego-driven from the outside looking in. But there's actually a lot more going on there.
Nice. And talk more about also his motivation as a ruler, because my understanding is that both he's an absolute monarch, to be sure. He's not a Democrat. But he does want, and I mean that in sort of democracy, not political parties. But my understanding is that he also wants, in his understanding, what is best for his people. And then a lot of his desire to rule the world is because he thinks he would be best. It's not I want to rule the world, mwahaha. A lot of it's the ego, but am I right? A lot of it's also this idea that if the world would be a better place if he was in control.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He's coming from a standpoint that he thinks he's the best person for the job. That is why he wants that absolute power. So you're absolutely correct in that. And in terms of his leadership, it's kind of funny the fact that he is a character that's coated in iron armor, and he actually has a stint as Iron Man, but we can get into that later. But I don't think his people would describe him as ruling with an iron fist. He's, for all intents and purposes, he is a pretty, I don't know if benevolent is the right word, but he is a fair leader, and he has his people's best interest at
Right.
heart. So
There's not burgeoning movements to overthrow the king and install a republic that he's constantly having to fight down or things like that.
There are small instances of that, but yeah, for the most part, the people of Liberia actually respect him, and they admire him, and actually they're thankful to him for freeing them from the reign of a tyrannical baron that was in place before he rose to power.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. That all makes sense.
Yeah.
One particular story that I found that I was reading about that I thought was interesting is that I think really speaks to this is that apparently at one point, I know he has a lot of interactions with Black Panther and people of Wakanda, and that at one point he, and this is quoting from an article I read, and the quote is that once he even went so far as to let his soul lay bare and be judged by the Panther god of Wakanda, who determined that he genuinely wished for a utopian future where humanity thrived, albeit one where he was in power. Does that strike you as pretty accurate to the character?
Yeah, I would say so. It kind of speaks to, again, he thoroughly believes that he's the right person for the job. And again, it speaks to that, what makes the character so fascinating and so nuanced. It's the fact that he is so absolute in his belief that he's the right person for the job that is his fault. He is
right.
unable to see his inadequacies and where he is wrong, and that's what constantly puts him, in opposition to the heroes of the Marvel Universe. Right.
And it's interesting because that's something we've talked about a lot on this podcast in terms of other villains. This idea that, what you describe, I think, is a fairly common idea for a villain. In Doom's case, I think it's more about ego than in others.
I would agree.
But often there becomes this kind of self-justification of, I know that what I am doing will make the world a better place. And so therefore that leads me to two thoughts. One, anything that I feel is necessary to do in order to get to that better place will clearly, it's the right thing to do. And that anyone who stands in my way is clearly the enemy of the good thing that I want to have happen. And then the other part, though, is that there's never accountability. That if I know absolutely in my heart that what I am doing is right, and that I should say to the whole world, you move instead of me. I'm not making any allusions to any particular Marvel movies there anymore, but just that once you have that complete assurance that you and only you know what's right, that you're never going to listen to someone else saying, like, hey, maybe you might be wrong here, which is something Cap does. Everyone was wanting to shout at me about that. I know. That's not I was just making a joke there. But but for sure. So I think to me, that's one of the most interesting things about this character you're talking about, because it feels like he really fits that mold of the person who is so focused on how much he wants to do good that he's stopped kind of asking himself those needed questions about, am I actually doing more harm than good?
That's actually a really interesting point, and I love that you bring that up. He is very much so the ends justify the means type of character, but there is a level. There's almost something admirable about his resoluteness, and I've never quite heard him compared to Cap like that, but it's not unfair, and I actually really like that. That's
nice.
Something to be explored there.
Yeah, and so I think there's also something about that he has a code of honor that's a very strong part. Is that kind of what you're referring to as well there?
Oh, yeah. You say a suit of armor or a coat of armor? I'm not sure.
A code of armor. Like, I'm sorry, a code of honor.
Honor. Oh, yes, of course, yes. He is.
I know he also has a suit of armor, which we'll talk more about as well. But.
Yeah. Yes, he does. It's one of the more iconic aspects of his visual portrayal there. But very much so, he does have a code of honor. There are many different types of villains out there, and we've seen some of the more relatable ones on the big screen here with Thanos recently, Killmonger. They've been these Marvel villains that are a little more. It's a little easier to understand their motivations, and I would definitely I would definitely put Doctor Doom in the same category. He's not a Joker. He's not an Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men. Sorry to kind of mix genres here, but
no, it's quite okay. He's another great villain.
Yeah, as a film fan, it's just like when I think about the different types of villains, there's definitely you've got the forces of nature, which I think Joker, Kong, Anton Chigurh all fall in that category. Doom is not one of those at all, and that's
Right.
again part of the reason that it's so easy for him to kind of float between these different categories. So often he has been the villain, but it's
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, over on the Star Wars podcast, we talk a lot about that phrase that gets used all the time about, seeing things from a certain point of view.
Mm.
And I think the line is interesting because it's mostly Obi-Wan trying to cover his own ass about how he lied to Luke. But the point, I think, is also a very important one for this, in that there's so many of these stories where I think if it was told in a somewhat different way, you could tell basically the same story, but have it be someone else as the hero. That Killmonger or Kingpin could tell the story of Daredevil or Black Panther in a way that makes them the hero.
Oh.
And I think there's a whole other idea here of the whole history idea of the winners are the ones who tell the stories. And there's such an interesting question of so we get these hero stories, who tells them, all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And it sounds like Doom, it's very much the same way, that when he's talking about what he's done, he's always the hero of his story. Reed and the rest of the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, whoever goes against him, they're the enemies. They're the ones who are against him, stopping him from doing good.
Correct. Yeah, he is very much the hero of his own story. He sees all opposition as them being in the wrong and them being the villains. Mm-hmm. And it really does speak to what you alluded to. Whoever writes, they say history is written by the victors.
Right.
So it'd be interesting to see history from a Latvian textbook, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely, for sure. And, kind of what kind of control does he have about, are there any Latvian history professors who've been locked up for telling things that aren't supposed to be told and things like that? Go ahead.
Oh, after you.
So, is there anything else you want to tell us about Doom himself before we kind of step back a bit and talk about some of the different ideas of heroism and villainy that we're going to use to kind of look at him and some other villains?
Just in terms of the big swings, we've talked about his storied history as a villain of the Fantastic Four, but before we get into more of the anti-hero and even heroic runs, I would in terms of big villain arcs, Secret Wars is one I would definitely recommend people kind of go back and see, and that kind of positions him. He's the master manipulator. He's got basically all the villains and all the heroes on both sides. He's playing them. He's basically the ultimate double, triple agent, and he winds up with that ultimate goal of getting the ultimate power. I don't want to spoil things out entirely, but it might be more than he bargained for, and it might be a bit of a comeuppance for him. But definitely an interesting
and that ties into something when we're going to talk about the different categories of hero or villain, and I want to add a new one for him that I think he may exemplify pretty well.
Oh, sure.
But let's just start by kind of defining what we're talking about. When you hear the terms hero and villain and anti-hero, let's just start with hero. What to you is a hero?
For me, hero is synonymous with sacrifice. I would say those that are willing to sacrifice themselves or of themselves to protect an ideal or a group of people. That's what a hero is to me.
Right. It's interesting that you focus on sacrifice, because it's the idea of that they're not just sort of out for themselves, that they are trying to do some good for someone else in some way. Mm-hmm. I've always thought that's an important thing, and it's why I think there are some movies that I've always thought are really interesting where it's about a character who has a certain amount of power. Maybe it's because they're like a very well-trained fighter, or maybe they're a superhero. It could be an action movie, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to save a bus of school children and you're putting yourself in danger because they're people and you want to help them, to me that's a hero. If you're trying to save a bus of kids because your son or daughter or your child is on that bus, I don't think it makes what you're doing less heroic. But to me, that's not quite the hero action the same way, because you're doing this very much out of your own self-interest. And I haven't really thought of it before in terms of the sacrifice, but I think that it's certainly a trope of how the heroes have often been defined in our world, especially in this media of comic books and movies and things like that, where the noble sacrifice, the I will give up my ability to have a normal life or to have a normal romantic partner, or some part of my life has gone away. That certainly seems a very common thing that we get.
Yeah, and I would argue that often is what separates some of the most altruistic heroes from some of these villains that, any other day, any other circumstance, you might call them the hero. They're not often willing to make the sacrifice, whether it's a personal sacrifice. They might be more willing to make a general sacrifice, one that doesn't affect them personally, but I do think that's what separates an actual hero from someone that sees themselves as a hero. And again,
right.
In the lens of looking at this through Doom, that I think that's what separates him from Reed.
Interesting. In that Reed is willing to make those sacrifices in a way Doom is not.
Yeah, and not even Reed is not a hero without his own faults. He definitely has some pride issues there, but again, that's apart from Doom. He is willing to acknowledge fault in some circumstances, and if it came down to it, I do think he would sacrifice himself for his family.
That makes sense. Yeah, and that can sometimes be part of that kind of villain rationality we talked about before, where you could see it very selfishly as like, well, I want to do as much good as I can, but I don't want to die. Which, I mean, I'm not by any means like, that's how I would probably approach a lot of these things. I'm not saying that I think that by definition makes you a villain.
Sure.
It's more that I think what a lot of times the villain can fall into is this idea of thinking the world needs me to save it. So if I risk my life to save these 20 kids on a school bus or whatever it is, well, but then the billions of people who might suffer because I wasn't there to save them.
Sure.
Sure. Which is obviously kind of like you step back from it. You're like, that's some pretty self-righteous and like, you win out pretty well in that particular line of thinking. But it's one that I think characters can fall into a lot.
Yeah.
So compare that to an anti-hero. How would you define an anti-hero as opposed to a hero in this regard?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when I was hashing this out in my thoughts, breaking down a hero and the differences and the disparities between a hero, an anti-hero, and a villain. I think one could argue that an anti-hero is almost the least ethical in a way, because they are operating by their own ethical code. And who's the this is a pretty deep topic here, but who is the ultimate judge of what is the correct ethical code? So if you're operating by your own ethical code and what you believe is right, like I think of a character, Punisher. Punisher right. Seems like the ultimate anti-hero to me, but I think a lot of people would say he's a villain. He certainly has on screen. We've seen him clash with Daredevil.
Right. Yeah, I would say I think season 1 and season 2 of Punisher in the Netflix version are to me a good example of the distinction between I think he's an anti-hero in the first one and becomes much more of a villain in the second one.
Ooh, okay.
But part of I think what you're getting at is that that you're right, that this isn't objective. There isn't any one sort of moral universal standard for what is moral and what is therefore heroic or anti-heroic. If there was, this podcast wouldn't exist.
Right.
And I think you're right that for Frank Castle, he very much would see himself in that heroic role. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an interesting part of the anti-hero is that I often think of the anti-hero as the person who does the good thing for reasons or in methods that we find problematic.
Okay.
But where the audience perspective and the perspective of our heroes is often, I don't think I would be comfortable doing what he did, but I'm also not sorry that they did it. Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, totally. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, because as you were basically describing all those motivations, the other anti-hero that comes to mind is V from V for Vendetta. And
yes.
Basically exactly what you said. You almost admire what he is doing on the screen, but you would never do it yourself.
Right. Yeah. And V is one we've talked about a lot because he's one of my absolute favorites.
Oh, okay.
I feel like V is, not to get too far off board, but we'll get back to this. V to me is unique in that he is an anti-hero, who knows that he's an anti-hero.
Correct.
And what I mean by that, and I think you're in the same page, is that he knows that what he wants is vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
And he also knows that rebuilding the English society and government shouldn't be done on vengeance. And that's why I think he gives that great speech about how he shouldn't be part of the new world that Evie can help create. And that, to me, there's always this wonderful juxtaposition of him very violently killing the people he wants revenge on, but then the people of England completely non-violently taking back their government.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And then as we're just kind of discussing it here, you bring up Evie as well. A lot of his treatment of Evie is really problematic and can certainly be described as villainous. And I think both of them acknowledge that.
Yeah, and she would say, like, she thinks she's a better person for what happened, but she never consented to it, and he couldn't know that she'd be a better person. And so, yeah, she has this both respect and in some ways almost a love for him, but also she can't be with him anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
But he does make that sacrifice in the end. So, again, where,
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but does he cross back into heroic in that regard?
I think in his own story he does, and in Evie's story he does, and certainly for the revolutionaries. But yeah, there's certainly some questions.
That's a good way to look at it. I think especially because it also goes into these questions of the methods versus the goals. And I think when I look at someone like Frank Castle, part of my problem with a character like his, and not to make this about the Punisher, and we can go back and forth and get back to Doom.
Sure.
For me, it's that a lot of the time with Frank Castle and the Punisher, that line of, is my problem with his motivations and methods, or my problem with what he's actually trying to do, starts to get murky, in that I don't know if just killing drug dealers is the way to solve drug problems, or if just, continuing cycles of violence is the way to fix cycles of violence. You can there are conversations people have all the time now about, if Batman used his money to, address the root causes of crime instead of beating up poor criminals, like, maybe that would be a different perspective. And there are comics in which he absolutely does that. He's just not done it as much in the movies, which is too bad. I know, going way off topic.
No,
but
you're good. I don't think philanthropy is as cinematic.
Right? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the problem. Like, showing him at the Grand Gala, like, I want to see him doing that. But you're right, it doesn't make for as good. A small network, like a Netflix TV show, that's where we could get that.
Okay, I'm on board.
But so, yeah, and so let's go into that third category. So for you, that's a hero or an anti-hero. What makes an actual villain?
What separates a villain from an anti-hero, because I think that's where you get a little more in the weeds. It's a little more obvious what separates a hero from a villain. There are some similarities there, and again, that I said, a villain could be the hero of his own story. But I would say they're much more willing to sacrifice pawns. Again, more often than not, the ends justify the means.
Right.
But I do think one of the more fascinating or interesting aspects of a villain, we talked about the forces of nature versus the agents of chaos versus the mustache twirlers.
Right.
And, I would say Doom has served stints as all versions of those.
No, yeah, I can definitely get that. And some reading through his motivations over the years, and I'm sure part of that's just, the same characters written for 60 years. Different people are going to write them, different people are going to take them in different directions. But I think it says a lot about the character that he's so variable and that he can be approached from all these different directions.
Yeah, without a doubt. And in terms of him being a force of nature, one of the things we saw in early iterations is he made use of Doombots. Are you familiar with the Doombots at all? Yeah, the Doombot
it's basically a mechanical creation, but especially because Doom lives in a suit of metal, no one can tell this is a robot instead of him, and that they're programmed to believe they are him when they're not in his presence, and so they're very good at fooling people about who he is.
Correct. They're basically these automatonic creations that are copies of Doom, and they actually retain all of his memories. So for the average person that would approach one of these things, they would actually think that they are Doctor Doom.
And I think those are one of the most interesting parts of his story, as well as kind of being interesting. I often like to get a little bit meta and talk about kind of why writers do things and stuff like that. And for a couple of the writers I looked at confirmed this, because I think the Doombots are also a fascinating and really powerful plot device. Because, with comic books especially, people often talk about, like, how do you hold continuity over 60 years, not have the character do the same thing again and again and again, but also have the character stay true to sort of one common core idea. And so I love that apparently many times in the history, they've written a Doom storyline and then been like, do we really want to have Doom do that? No, actually it was a Doombot. It wasn't him. We can just take it all back.
That's a great point that you bring up there, and that is an interesting aspect to the character there. He has been able to basically be all walks of life,
right, and
all versions of the character. But in terms of the different types of villains out there, I think what separates him from some of the more sympathetic villains. Excuse me. I think what separates him from some of the more sympathetic villains out there. You bring up Star Wars, and of course my mind goes to Darth Vader, and arguably the story of Star Wars is the rise, fall, and redemption.
100%.
Of Darth Vader. We get so many of those beats in the overall story of Doom. He starts off as the villain. We are initially introduced to him as a villain. As time goes on, we get his backstory, his childhood in Latveria and the loss of his mother. And basically, he's on this quest for ultimate power to free his mother and to free Latveria. And that's a bit of the redemption, but what separates him from someone like Darth Vader is he gets that redemption, but then he's still a bastard at the end of the day. Sorry, is it okay to use that kind of language?
That's fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So when we look at Secret Wars 2, which was a run in 2015, basically we've got all the different. It was basically Marvel's answer to consolidating all the various multi dimensions they had there, consolidating them into one continuity. And basically he took the opportunity, he teamed up with Doctor Strange, and when the time was right, he stole the Beyonder's power. And the Beyonders basically controls time, space, existence. He's basically the Infinity Gauntlet turned into a character. So
interesting.
Yeah, I just think it's nice that he is a villain's villain, even though he does fit the label of anti-hero and hero sometimes as well.
Well, and I think that's interesting as well, because the last time we talked about villains, we used those three categories. But hearing you talk about him, and also a lot of what I've read about him, I feel like there's a fourth category that we should put for him, and maybe some others fall into this, especially in comic books, which is ally.
Okay.
And that what I mean here is a situation where a person still has villainous intent and is not, suddenly having a moral revelation that the Fantastic Four or the Super Friends or whoever it is are good people. It's just that something even worse has now come around. And the villain has now decided to team up with our heroes because they're unified against this shared enemy. And I always think those stories are interesting because in those stories, and like Loki does this all the time, Magneto and Professor X do this sometimes. I'm understanding is Doctor Doom does this a lot of the time. It happens all the time. Is that one of the things you get is that sometimes there is some level of like, okay, this greater enemy has realized that my villainy is wrong and that I should be working with you. And so there's some of that with Magneto and Professor X. Often there's not. That's not there. Because what more often happens is and especially Loki, this is often true, like, I'm still a bastard. I'm still going to do everything I can to get my own personal advantage out of this. But for this set period of time, while we share this mutual enemy, I'm going to feel like your ally as we fight this ally. And so I'm going to be fighting on the side of the heroes, even though my basic stance as a villain has by no means changed.
Correct. I would say that represents a major evolution, not only I would say primarily for Doom as a character. I can't say off the top of my head the first time we saw him team up with, whether it was the Fantastic Four or another set of heroes. As you mentioned, he is a frequent collaborator of not only Doctor Strange, but also he's teamed up with Iron Man. And even, as I mentioned, he actually served a stint as the infamous Iron Man.
Mm.
But yeah, in terms of being an ally, I think for the most part, it kind of ties back to his motivations of the ends justify the means. When can I use these people to my advantage?
Right.
But in terms of his evolution, again, his hubris, his pride his ego is probably his most defining characteristic. So those instances where he does have to acknowledge that he could use other people's help or other people could benefit him, it's probably pretty tough for him to swallow that pill.
Yeah. No, I can definitely imagine that. And one thing that I love is that in a lot of the stuff I was reading, they talk about how either A, there's sometimes a feeling of, well, the world is facing this great threat, and it would just drive Doom crazy if Reed Richards gets more of the credit. And that the other part of it is sometimes it's he is so determined that he be the one to either kill or to stop, or in other words, sort of defeat Reed Richards. And it's not just that he wants Reed Richards dead or out of the way, it's that he wants Reed to know that Doom beat him. And so the idea that someone else would kill Reed is very much like the Joker being like, only I can kill the Batman.
Right.
I get the sense that comes up with Doom a lot, is like, no, I will fight anyone who tries to kill Reed Richards, because only I get to kill him.
There certainly is an element of that. I don't know if it's as strong or as pronounced as the relationship between Joker and Batman in that regard. You know, there's this is almost borderline romantic in that regard.
Yeah, definitely.
Given Reed and Doom's history, there always is, as much as they are thorns in each other's side, there is still a begrudging respect there. So I think that there have been several instances where Doom has stepped in to protect Reed,
right,
for just that kind of instance, you know?
So one question I would have about Doom, and again, this is coming from someone who has only seen him in a couple of the movies, doesn't know the character very well. But I know that often one of the things, and this is just basic human psychology, and you can debate if it's good or bad, and I think probably there's a lot of problems with it, but a basic part of human psychology and just our makeup is it's a lot easier for us to both relate to and also therefore to forgive people who look more like us, and that's a lot of, like there's a lot of racism and gender stuff that can go into that. But especially even just like, or often it's like the person you find attractive is more easy to forgive. But also it's just that ability of like the more humanity you see from someone. Since Doom's, my understanding is that except for like one or two panels where we see that either his face is horribly disfigured or that he's got this one tiny scar, depending on the telling of the story, we almost never see Doom's face. We almost never, all we really see is this kind of very Darth Vader-like, metal suit of armor from which a voice emerges. Do you think people would find him less of a pure villain if he was more relatable in that regard, if he wasn't just this like suit of metal walking around?
I do think he would probably be as respected and probably as affluential as a Reed Richards type had he not encased himself. But that part of the character is given his Romani origins, he's always been very much a social outcast. So, his time at university with Reed Richards and other students, like there were attempts to bring him in and let him have some normal semblance of a social life, but he rebuffed those. So he is very much doing this to himself, not only encasing himself in a suit of armor physically, he does that also figuratively in his personal life. But another interesting aspect of that whole phenomenon where he's hiding himself in the armor, you mentioned the certain iterations where all it is just a tiny little nick on his face, and that goes back into pride is always a huge part of the character. But sometimes that ties into vanity, and I think that's something especially in this day of social media and selfies and stuff like that. I think that's something we can all relate to.
For sure. This is going to be a total jump, but I think it's
Okay.
relevant. Have you been watching the TV show, or have you read the book, The Stand?
No, I have not, but I'm very interested in it. I just have not made time for it yet, but I will. I know you guys are covering it, so I'm excited for that.
No, okay. Well, I won't say anything spoiler about that. I'll use other examples, but I think there's a trope I think that happens a lot, and it's real because it's something I think so many of us can so easily relate to. Of the person who is fearful of being rejected, fearful of being judged, and so they wind up like the person who might want social connection, but they're so fearful of being judged, they just cut themselves off from that entirely. It's the kind of like, I'm going to reject you before you can reject me. I'm not going to let you see me so that you can't judge me. And it seems like in some ways Victor Van Doom is just a full embodiment of that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a very appropriate parallel to make for modern audiences. And there may have been some... Again, the execution is not there, and it's very surface level, but they may have been going for a little bit of something like that with the 2015 Fantastic Four from Josh Trank, because, that Doom was very much the hacktivist type of
wounded
character.
emo boy who no one understands.
Yeah, but I think the way that you broke it down is pretty poignant, and I even in my own life, I could take a little bit of something away from that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's certainly one I can relate to, and I think a lot of us, I think a lot of us turned. This is not true by any means, and I think we have many fans who were, the kings and queens of their high school and middle school and whatever. But I think for a lot of fans, especially those of us who are a little older in our 30s or 40s, like you and me, when we first became fans of this stuff, it wasn't the most socially popular and socially cool thing to do. And there was that little bit of a cycle of like, well, I don't want people to judge me for the fact that I love Star Wars, that I play these role-playing games, or that I love comic books, or whatever it is. So I'm going to pull back a little bit and only hang out with the people who kind of are into that sort of thing. That's what I love about Stranded Panda so much, is a lot of it's about kind of breaking out of that and being like, no, wait, we don't have to be stranded. There is this whole world of people who love these things. And we can build these communities about them that aren't just the toxic, like, no one else allowed in our clubhouse kind of things that, unfortunately, that can lead to. All of which is to say is I think this would be something I'd love to see really explored with Doom in whatever new iterations we're going to get in the new movies. And so I want to put a pin in that, and let me first just go back to kind of the main topic you wanted to talk about, which is, so we can clearly see where he is as a villain. Tell me about some of the versions we've had where Victor is the anti-hero or even a hero.
So I think one of the most classic examples of Dr. Doom serving in the role of an anti-hero is Secret Wars, which I mentioned before. And that involves basically a cavalcade of both Marvel heroes and villains, Dr. Doom chief among them, basically going up against the Beyonder in Battle World. And again, this is an instance where he's having to make that sacrifice and play well with others. So that's kind of the first inklings of that evolution to him not being the straight up villain, and that I guess that can kind of be said for several of the other villains that participate in that. The Absorbing Man, Magneto, we spoke about before, Mole Man, but I would say in the instance of both Doctor Doom and Magneto, their tendency to lean towards the more anti-hero aspect stuck around more so.
Well, and so to you, how does that differ from the ally category we're talking about? Is it because in those cases it does seem like there's a degree of sacrifice, or at least there's a degree of, I'm not just doing this for my own purposes, I'm doing this because this is for a greater cause?
Well, initially I hadn't really considered the ally aspect. It was only in this conversation that that you bring it up. I do think ally is probably more an appropriate category. Maybe he's not so much an anti-hero, and I'm kind of discovering that as we're having this conversation. Maybe he's a hero, a villain, and an ally, and not so much an anti-hero. But in terms
and it's something I just made up now, so it may well be that I'm just coming up with a different word for anti-hero.
You're good. I do think it is appropriate, because I do think there are aspects of an anti-hero that can be a little more, a little more specificity there. Like we brought up V from V for Vendetta. I think Deadpool also qualifies as an anti-hero. Lobo from the DC universe. And one of the really well-known ones I would say is James Bond.
Oh, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, he's this very cool character that's doing these things to save society, save the British Empire, save the world. But he is definitely very problematic in his approach and some of the things he does and the sacrifices he makes. Mm-hmm. So only in that regard, I would say, maybe you could still qualify Doom. He's still a little unsavory in his approach, but he has a good motivation. But from his perspective, he always has a good motivation.
Let me give you an example of a character that I see as fitting very neatly into kind of being an anti-hero as he is an ally, and tell me if you think this would sort of fit for Doom as well.
Sure.
And it's a character of Anakin Skywalker, specifically in the TV show The Clone Wars, because in that show, which obviously is very much about his sort of slow decline and fall into the dark side and becoming Darth Vader,
okay,
one of the themes that they repeat a couple of times, and I'm not going to mention any specific spoilers, but this is kind of a generalized spoiler for plot points in the Clone Wars, although, spoiler, Anakin becomes Darth Vader. But one of the things that will sometimes happen is a couple of the Jedi will be in a situation that it is very hard to find a moral right answer to. Often about a prisoner who is now a helpless prisoner, and so killing that person would be morally wrong, but they can't imagine a way to keep this person prisoner without them continuing to do great harm. And there's at least 2 or 3 times where some version of this is playing out, and as the Jedi are debating it, Anakin just walks up and kills the person. And you can see that all the rest of the Jedi are horrified that he did this, but are also on some levels relieved. Because he got his hands dirty in a way that meant that they could sort of stay idealistic and stay pure and not have to do not have to make the hard choice.
Okay.
And I think that's a dynamic I think we sometimes see, especially in why heroes keep anti-heroes around sometimes. Is like, that the Punisher will do the thing that Daredevil won't feel comfortable with, or that Spider-Man won't feel comfortable with.
Okay.
But maybe they need to have happen.
Hearing you kind of explore it through that lens, and I think Anakin is perfect, especially through the lens of the Clone Wars, because as you mentioned, as much as he is serving as an ally, we all ultimately know where he ends up as a character.
Right.
But to kind of tie it back to Doom, as you were talking about that, it did remind me of a similar instance where characters should have relied on Doom to come in and step in and do that, to provide them that relief, but they didn't. And then we kind of see the aftermath and Doom's response to that. So there's a more recent run where Namor actually creates a cabal with Thanos and the Black Order. But things quickly get out of hand, and he goes back to Doom, and he's like, "Can you help me?" And Doom is basically, "No, you went to number 1, Thanos and the Cabal first, then you went to Reed Richards and the other heroes. Now you come to me third. You should have come to me first, guy." So
right. And so there, his pride is kind of what stops him from getting involved and getting his hands dirty there.
Yeah, and for all, we don't know exactly what would have happened because we didn't get to explore that branch of the multiverse, but a lot of times Doom is right. Had Namor, approached him, they probably could have found a more, maybe not the morally correct course of action, but probably the one that would have had the least amount of casualties. In
many people's view, by definition, that is the moral thing to do. I don't necessarily think it always is, but it's certainly one moral perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what does it mean then for him to be a hero? Where are the times where you see Doom acting like a hero?
So one of the major revelations about the character of Doom, and I've already spoken on it several times here, it's we find out his motivation for this ultimate power that he's been seeking is to free his mother's soul. His mother is trapped in hell. Her soul was sold to Mephisto. And this was basically an attempt to free the people, the Romani people, from the Baron that was ruling Latveria at the time.
Right.
So, in that regard, we've talked about, what defines a hero to us, and sacrifice, I mentioned at the top of the show, is one of the key aspects to being a hero for me. And when we get this revelation that he's basically sacrificed his entire life, he's sacrificed his opportunities at romance, he's sacrificed his career opportunities, he's sacrificed his opportunity at a deep friendship and partnership with Reed Richards, as well as the rest of the Fantastic Four potentially. He's done all this to free his mother. and to save his people and his home. And in this storyline that we find all this, and this all becomes concrete to us, it is actually the run where Victor Von Doom has stepped up and taken the mantle of Iron Man from Tony Stark.
Right.
You know, this is the period of time where Tony Stark died as a result of Civil War II. Spoilers for Civil War II.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a period of time where multiple people are kind of stepping into the role of Iron Man. We see Riri Richards. This is where she is introduced as Ironheart. And then Doctor Doom has his stint as the infamous Iron Man. Really cool get up. He's got the silver Iron Man armor with his... It's kind of a mash between his classic look and Tony's armor.
Right.
It's really cool. And he actually has... You get to explore. You talk about the number of times we've seen Doom in the panels without his helmet on. This is one of the ones where you get a lot of his inner conflict and turmoil. You know, he really does want to turn over a new leaf in this run, and he actually wants to live up to the legacy of Iron Man and Tony Stark. He has respect for Iron Man and Tony Stark. And again, just talking about the long run this character has had and the evolutions there, I think this is where we actually see him serve as a hero.
Right. I can see that. And the way you tell that story about him and his mother especially, and not that this person I'm about to mention is a hero, but I kept getting vibes of Mr. Freeze and his story, you know, and that he is doing everything he can, sacrificing everything he can to bring back his wife. And there's often a real level of sort of romance to his character and this noble sacrifice, and this idea that he's often willing to do anything and everything and to be horribly villainous, but that there's a way to tell his story that could make him heroic, where he wasn't, you know, doing horrible things, but he was doing everything in service of this noble goal. And so I like the idea that we could tell Doom's story in a similar way, of when it's not about he'll do all these horrible things, but that he will sacrifice everything in order to help his mother, in order to help his people, whatever it is.
Yeah, hearing it kind of broken down like that as well. I don't know if you're familiar with Breaking Bad, but it's kind of
very much so, yeah.
It's kind of the opposite of Breaking Bad, whereas Walter White's his motivation started out so good well, I won't say so good, but he obviously wanted to take care of his own and his family, but along the way he lost himself. But we look at characters like Doom, and I like that you bring up Mr. Freeze. They are definitely kind of it really is interesting. We're kind of seeing the opposite, where you're given a blanket mustache twirling villain, and as you explore what was actually there, you can actually argue for the fact that they're a hero. Whereas Walter White is the exact opposite. He starts off as a bumbling guy, and at the end he's absolutely despicable. There's nothing. Well, I guess that's up for debate whether or not there are redeeming qualities there, but that's another podcast.
Although certainly for both of them, so much you talked about how Walter White starts out with these noble intentions, and I think on some level you're right, but we know in the first or second episode that he has the chance to get all the money he needs, but his pride won't let him. So, right. And I think in actually that regard, there's a very strong connection with him and Doom.
That's very true. I had kind of forgotten that aspect of it, but yeah, you're totally right. Pride is a major through line in both characters.
And I think one thing that I didn't really quite understand where you were coming from, I think, when we started this discussion of this topic, but I think I really do now see it, because part of what I'm getting out of this, and I think this is kind of what you had in mind, is that one of the things that makes Doom a character that's so interesting is that context matters so much, you know, and that there are some characters who you really have to adjust the dials on them to make them more of a hero or an anti-hero or a villain, you know. They have to suddenly really start caring about something that they've never cared about before, or suddenly give up thoughts about something that they've always wanted. But what I'm getting from Doom is that he's a character who he is a genius and a, inventor and a scientist who has these incredible goals and this incredible ambition and all this pride as this kind of, very Greek hero, like a tragic flaw. And that depending on the circumstance, in some situations he will do the absolute worst evils because that's what he thinks is needed. In other situations, he'll act absolutely heroic or be an ally. And that he's a character who, it seems like, depending on what part of his story you tell, he's going to appear very different, but without changing the core of that character.
Agreed, yes. So, yeah, initially when we set out to kind of set up this topic, that is what I had in mind. Can a character fit into all these different archetypes without sacrificing who they are at their core? Right. And I think through this discussion we have revealed that not only has Doctor Doom fit all those, he has done it without sacrificing who he is at his core. And, we did mention the Doom bots and some of the evolutions that he's gone from, his initial debut. But all that said, I still think you could take that debut Victor Von Doom from the original Fantastic Four and compare him to hopefully, well, I'll say, first of all, compare him to the modern version that we see in the comics today. But what I hope for is the one that we see on screen now that you said we've seen Doom on screen a few times and he left something to be desired. I really hope we get an on-screen Doom that, does justice to this character that has such a long running and nuanced history in the comics.
Right. For sure, because one thing that occurs to me when you talk about that he can be all three is that if you want to tell me that this is all part of the same character and all part of the same narrative, and that a person can be heroic in certain circumstances, but will be willing to be villainous in other circumstances, I'm going to tell you that's a villain, just flat out, and that there are particular moments of heroism, you have to do it all the time. Like, you can't, or you have to have a redemption arc. But I think what's interesting is that the way I'm understanding this is because it's not just one continuous narrative, it's all of these sort of arcs and mini narratives and things like that, that there are self-contained stories about Doctor Doom where from the beginning to the middle to the end, he is just the ally, he's just the hero. And that you can sort of put him in some of those like otherworld type situations or the what if kind of things and make him be a completely different role in the universe as a hero, but without changing the core of his character.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's something I would actually love to see explored. We're getting the What If series from Disney Plus here, seeing what different Marvel characters we've already seen on screen, what they might look like in different scenarios and situations. I would love to see Doom. Had he been given a different upbringing, maybe he would be the poster boy of the Avengers. Right.
If just he had listened to Reed before that one experiment that Matt marked his face, however much it happened or didn't happen.
Correct.
Yeah. For sure. There's a lot more I know we can get into, and I think we'll definitely have you back at some point, especially as we get close to the Fantastic Four movies, as well as because I'd love to take this idea and apply it to the characters. But I want us to start wrapping up. So let me just ask, and we've hinted at this, but I want you to go further. What are you hoping for from Doctor Doom in the movies that we may get, or I think we're definitely going to get, but when exactly it is, we don't quite know yet.
Right. So, without getting too inside baseball for people, there were actually some rumblings that Noah Hawley, who has done Legion on FX for Fox, he was briefly attached to a Doom project, and that's all we really knew about it. It was a standalone Doom project. So, with that in mind, I would love to see. We've already had 3 versions of the Fantastic Four. I think people are pretty familiar with the Fantastic Four. There are ways to seed the Fantastic Four into the Marvel Cinematic Universe going forward. I know we've got the film announced, but I would love to see Doom either given his own miniseries on Disney Plus or his own outright film to introduce him before he clashes with the Fantastic Four. Or if it's the miniseries, of course, I'd be open to the Fantastic Four popping up there. But in terms of the character, I really hope that they, and I think they will follow suit with some of the more recent villains we've seen, namely Killmonger as well as Thanos, where, as in the comics, it's a character that you should be questioning yourself and wondering, am I on this guy's side? Like, should I be rooting for him? In terms of the casting and everything like that, I think it's pretty open to interpretation. Latveria could be anywhere that they want. I would prefer that they skew a little bit older, not terribly older, but someone that could bring the proper gravitas and the history there. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I love that idea you're talking about because of giving him his own movie or his own series, because I think one of the things we talk about a lot here, and we've talked about a lot today, is that, when a character is introduced in the context of someone else's story, you're kind of seeing them through someone else's eyes.
Mm.
And it would be great to sort of see Doom's story through his own eyes, and not necessarily with him being portrayed as a hero, but maybe being portrayed as kind of like the way Walter White is in Breaking Bad. It's we're seeing it through his eyes, we're seeing his justifications, and we, the audience, get to kind of sit back and judge and say, how do we feel about this? And then seeing him brought into the Fantastic Four, where now we're seeing him be a villain towards those characters, but we also have our own feelings, whether it's sympathy or judgment or whatever it is, wrapped up with him. So I think I would just love to see that, and I would just love to see more of... There's some parts of the character... I'm a big believer in the idea of modernizing things from the comics and from the stories, and, last week we did an episode on Cobra Kai, which is one of my favorite... was one of my favorite TV shows. Now I think the third season has really gone off the rails.
Oh.
And part of what I loved about it, that I don't think it did in the third season, is it took the idea of the 1980s martial arts action movie, The Karate Kid, and said, okay, that was a great movie, but we now see things very differently 40 years later, and we're not quite as, like, the world is divided up into heroes and bullies as easily, and we're sort of problematizing some of the parts of that story. I'd love to see parts of that be done with Doom, just if nothing else, like, we have a very different understanding of the Romani people today than we did when Doom was written, and so I don't know how he's written. I don't know if I don't know anything about that, but I certainly hope that there's like some cultural sensitivity in like how that's addressed. The idea of where it's just ego is like the thing that makes you want to conquer the world entirely. I'd love to see that given that some more depth, And again, this sounds like I'm being super critical of a character I haven't read much about, and so that's I don't mean that. Oh, I can tell from what you're saying. I know these are bad things about the character. I'm saying, from what I know, this is all that I know about the character, and I would love to learn more about those parts of the character. And because it may well be that they're already in the comics, or it may be that those are things that are kind of starting to be inserted. Because I think it sounds like a fascinating character. I think that it's funny. There's a great essay I wrote. This is now going to go completely off of the genre we're talking about, but one of my absolute favorite villains of all time is Iago from Shakespeare's Othello.
Okay.
And part of what makes Iago so wonderful is that he has absolutely zero motivation. He's a little bit wronged by Othello. He's a little bit, offended, but mostly and I think there's certainly a lot of racism in his character, but he's very much just like, I want to watch the world burn. I am this force of malignant evil because I can be. And he's terrifying for that reason when he's portrayed well. And I always think that, like, the mustache twirler villains, part of what makes them part of what makes them not work is because they very rarely achieve that level of, I am terrified by the fact that you exist and I don't know why. Like, to me, the Joker can sometimes get to that level, especially Mark Hamill's Joker.
Yeah, it's kind of abhorrent to the natural order of things. It's like
exactly
it's almost like the uncanny valley. It's like something doesn't fit here, and I refuse to accept it.
Right, and because, like you said, like, if we can look at a hero and say, or look at a villain and say, well, it's because this happened, then maybe we could fix that. If it's because he grew up poor, we can address poverty. If it's because he had an abusive father, we can address that kind of thing. When you have evil that just exists as just malignancy, that's terrifying as a character.
Certainly.
But it's something that has to be done, and so I feel like I want most villains to either be that, as a very rare thing, or to really appear to me as fully motivated, fully complex characters who are the heroes of their own story, who know what they want, who see what they want. And I feel like with Doom, we really have a chance to get that, which, frankly, as much as I love the MCU, it hasn't had as many great villains as some of the other. We have Killmonger, I think, was a great villain. I think some of the Netflix stories had great villains.
Right.
And then we've got a lot of Nazis and megalomaniacs, and in Thanos, someone who can't do math. So yeah, I guess I'm just really excited to just after hearing so many of these stories for so long, to see it happen and to see how it's going to be retold, and then to hear all of you talk about, like, is this a good representation of him? What do you like? What don't you like? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. One just little quick thing I want to add in there, just as we were talking about that, and maybe I'll get some flack for this, maybe rightfully so, but as we were talking about, I could not help but just kind of envision, Victor Von Doom is a monarch and a king of Latveria. We talk about this miniseries, and his pride. What if we almost got like a Tiger King documentary? I talked about that Ed Brubaker run where it was done from like the standpoint where it was like an interview documentary where he's being interviewed.
Oh, so it's kind of done by like a journalist in the MCU who is interviewing this monarch, and it's kind of like behind the scenes of the Latvian.
Exactly, but it's all, you can tell his machinations are in there, so even from like the production, you can tell like certain things are edited out and whatnot to make him look the best.
I mean, the MCU is definitely going deeper on the idea of different genres, and we are, by the time this releases, WandaVision will already be live. We're recording this before it has gone, but certainly it seems with WandaVision, the MCU is planning to blow the doors off of what like genre stories are supposed to be. So yeah, I'd love the idea of the mockumentary. I think that'd be a fantastic way to tell his story.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. And just in terms of, you spoke about those villains that are just, it's unnerving because they are so just straight up evil at their core. I think there's an avenue there with Doom, as much as we spoke to the nuance there. He does have connections to dark magic, and Mephisto and some of the demons that may or may not be popping up in WandaVision. So even if it's just to maybe endear us to him a little bit more, or provide that juxtaposition that he is not that abhorrent evil. He is a respectable evil with, I guess, an understandable motivation.
Right. And yeah, and that's the thing. You could just take him totally off the other end and just say, like, he started with these respectable motivations, but now the magic he's gotten into, the relationships he's had, he's just gone totally off the deep end. That could be another fun way to take the story.
Certainly, yeah. It might be more interesting that way, actually.
Yeah. 'Cause I think that's the thing is, like, to me, the problem with a mustache twirler is when they try to give us the explanation. I make fun of that line where Emperor Palpatine shouts, unlimited or ultimate power, because they're trying to say this is his motivation, and the motivation makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
And so I more like it, to me, the Heath Ledger Joker in the Dark Knight is so good because he keeps everyone keeps asking him what his motivation is, and he keeps making different things up. He makes up his origin story. It's clearly, there is no answer. It's just chaos. So
his origin is multiple choice.
Yeah, exactly. It's what you want it to be.
That's right.
So there's been a great discussion, J. Scotty. Thank you so much for suggesting it. Is there any other kind of last points you want to make before we wrap up?
No, I think we had a nice discussion here. As you mentioned, it'll be kind of cool to follow up as we get closer to the actual debut of the Fantastic Four in the MCU. And then, potentially once we've actually seen Doom on screen, it'll really be fun to have a follow-up to this discussion and see how satisfied we are with his portrayal.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. I'm sure the MCU cast will do a lot of that, but it'd be fun to jump in as well.
Yeah.
And folks, and Scotty, for people who are just hearing you now, a lot of my listeners aren't necessarily part of all the other Panda stuff. For people who are hearing you, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts. What other podcasting have you been doing specifically on the Panda Network? Or anywhere else?
Yeah, I'm pretty limited to the Stranded Panda Network at this point in time, but more recently here, Brian V. Klein and I teamed up to cover Fargo Season 4 for PandaVision, so I know the first half already came out. We took our time on the second half, so hopefully people aren't waiting around too long for that, but that'll be out soon. And then, of course, I teamed up with Matt for Bingers Assemble. We did all the coverage of Wonder Woman's appearances in the DCEU leading up to Wonder Woman 84, so that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed a lot of your perspectives on those. And I will say, funny enough, as soon as I get off with you, I'm going to have about a 5-minute break, and then I'm going to be recording with Brian V. Klein, because he's joining me for a discussion of the new Star Wars novel that just came out. So,
oh, cool.
It's one of the great things I love about Stranded Pandas. We have all these great voices and ideas and perspectives, and all sorts of different folks who can jump in and jump out. Next week, I'm going to have Jessica Plummer back on to discuss the comic book history we've been discussing a lot. I know Ashley Coffin and I have been doing a great series on The Stand on PandaVision. And of course, on StrandedPanda.com, you can find all of this, as well as other great podcasts about the MCU, DC, Star Wars, Star Trek, any of the universes you love. lots of great different perspectives. So, Scotty, thank you so much for being a part of this. To all of our listeners, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Be well, folks.